Good afternoon. Let me start by thanking Prime Minister Kishida and the people of Japan for their warm and generous welcome and hospitality. At this pivotal moment for peace, freedom and democracy, the G7 came together with our allies and friends to confront a more dangerous world. We leave Hiroshima stronger and more united than ever. And through this summit, we have advanced the priorities of the British people, with two big aims: economic security and national security. First, economic security. On this trip, we've secured almost £18 billion of new investments into the UK from Japanese businesses. That's a huge vote of confidence in the United Kingdom, creating hundreds of new jobs with significantly more to come as projects get underway, all helping to grow our economy, one of my 5 priorities for the UK. And alongside our unprecedented new defence and security partnership, it's clear that the UK-Japan relationship has never been closer as we work together with G7 allies to support a free and open Indo-Pacific. The G7 also demonstrated unity of purpose on China. China poses the biggest challenge of our age to global security and prosperity. They are increasingly authoritarian at home and assertive abroad. And as the G7 have showed, the UK's response is completely aligned with our allies. This is all about de-risking, not decoupling. And with the G7, we are taking steps to prevent China from using economic coercion to interfere in the sovereign affairs of others. A new theme of this summit was also AI. AI can bring huge benefits for our economy, society, and public services. But of course, it needs to be developed safely, securely, and fairly. And that will require international cooperation, something that the UK is in a natural position to lead. Our second aim for this summit was national security. All leaders at this summit are grappling with the issue of illegal migration. And my policy is this: it is the British government who will determine who comes to Britain. We must stop the boats and break the business model of the criminal gangs. This is a global issue, and it will increasingly be a focus of our international engagement. Just last week at the Council of Europe, we agreed to strengthen cooperation with the EU's border force. At this summit, we secured the G7's agreement to deepen our work together. And we expect this to be an important focus of the G7 next year under Italy's leadership. And there is no more pressing issue facing the G7 and the world than Ukraine. I want to pay tribute to my friend Vladimir. It was a privilege to welcome him to Chequers earlier this week. And I believe his attendance at this G7 was a moment of historic significance. The image of the G7 and our partners standing shoulder to shoulder with President Zelensky sends a powerful message about the unity and determination of the G7 allies. We will stand with Ukraine for as long as it takes because their security is our security. The G7 strategy is clear. Our military, diplomatic and economic tools are all part of the Ukrainian counter-offensive. We're delivering more support on the battlefield through air defence, artillery, tanks and long-range missiles, which the UK was the first country to provide. We're supporting Ukraine to develop the air force it needs for the future, with the UK training Ukrainian pilots starting this summer. And we've made a real breakthrough at this summit, thanks to President Biden's support for an international coalition to provide F-16 jets. We're ratcheting up the economic cost to Russia with a new package of sanctions. And we know that Ukraine must not only win the war, but win a just and lasting peace. We're working with allies to provide coordinated, bilateral security arrangements and a collective commitment to Ukraine's future defence to guarantee that they can deter future attacks. And any peace settlement must be on Ukraine's terms. I want to just quote from the statement that the G7 and our partner countries have just agreed. We support a just and durable peace based on respect for international law, the principles of the UN Charter, and territorial integrity and sovereignty. In other words, we must and we will show that violent territorial aggression does not reap rewards. There could be no more fitting place to discuss the urgent need for peace than Hiroshima. I was deeply moved to visit the Peace Memorial on Friday. What we saw there was haunting. A child's tricycle twisted by the blast, school uniforms bloodied and torn. And with those images in our minds, we resolved never to forget what happened here. And at this historic summit, G7 leaders recommitted ourselves to the path of peace, freedom, and democracy. Thank you. We've got time to take some questions from the media. Could I start with the BBC, please?
Thank you, Prime Minister. Chris Mason, BBC News. Will you ask the Independent Advisory on Ministers' Interests to look into your Home Secretary's conduct after she asked civil servants to help her deal with being caught speeding? And do you have full confidence in Suella Braverman?
Did you have any questions about the summit?
Others will, I think.
Great. Well, Chris, I don't know the full details of what has happened, nor have I spoken to the Home Secretary. I think you can see firsthand what I've been doing over the last day or so. But I understand that she's expressed regret for speeding, accepted the penalty, and paid the fine. Next, can I turn to ITV?
Yeah, I have got a question about the summit, but just on that, just a simple issue. If she asked her officials for advice on a private matter, her penalty, it's not appropriate for a minister to do that, is it? And then on China, you say it presents the greatest risk to our security and our prosperity, but then you talk about de-risking, not decoupling. There's nothing in this statement that will deter the behaviour of China, is there?
Well, Robert, on your first question, I'll just refer you to what I said previously. And I just respectfully would disagree with you on China, actually. There's complete resolve and unity within the G7. First of all, just recognising the systemic challenge that China poses to the world order. I think it's the only country with both the means and intent to reshape the world order. Its behaviour is increasingly authoritarian at home and assertive abroad. That's something that I think all of us recognise. And what we have done in the statement is make it very clear that we will work together as the G7 and other countries to make sure that we can de-risk ourselves and the vulnerability of the supply chains that we've seen from China, take the steps necessary to protect ourselves against hostile investment, and do so in a way that doesn't damage each other. We also had conversations about ensuring that important technology pertinent to our security does not leak to China, and then also steps taken to stop Chinese economic coercion in other parts of the world. I think taken together, that represents quite a substantive set of policy measures backed up by a completely unified resolve and commitment amongst the G7. I think it sends a strong signal to China that we believe in the rules-based international system, and we will work very hard together to protect it against the challenge that China poses. And that's certainly what we've done in the UK, just recently using our new powers to block hostile investment in a sensitive semiconductor company, and we keep a vigilant eye on other areas where we might be at risk, and we will always take the steps necessary to protect ourselves. But I think the message coming out of this summit is that our approach is totally aligned with that of our allies, and we are all very clear-eyed about the risk that China poses. Next, can I turn to Sky?
Thank you. Prime Minister, a couple of questions, if I may. Just on Suella Braverman, reports that the Home Secretary asked civil servants to help her avoid a speeding fine, makes a mockery of your government of integrity. Is she becoming a liability to your own reputation? And on Ukraine, President Macron said Zelensky's visit was a game changer. Chancellor Scholz said the supply of F-16 shows Russia it shouldn't expect to succeed by prolonging this war. Do the jets and the actions this weekend bring Ukraine closer to peace? And is it also an admission by the G7 that we are going to be in this for many, many years to come?
Well, Beth, on your first question, again, I just refer you to what I said previously. On the substantive issue of Ukraine and what this summit means for Ukraine, I think there are probably three important things for me. The first is President Zelensky's presence here. I think that in and of itself was a very powerful moment. To see President Zelensky standing shoulder to shoulder with his G7 allies, I think sends a powerful message to Russia and the world that we are united behind President Zelensky and his people, and will continue to support him for as long as it takes. I think the second thing coming out of the summit was the very tangible progress on providing further support to Ukraine, and most notably from President Biden with the announcement on F-16s, which is very welcome. You'll know this is something that I've spoken about in the past. Just last week I was discussing this with Mark Rutte from the Netherlands and making it clear that we had made provision to start training Ukrainian pilots incredibly soon, something that Vladimir and I have discussed a lot over the past few months. And then I think the third important thing is the conversation about peace that we had in the last session together with the partner countries that have been invited, and making it very clear what the principles of that peace should be based on. I think those calling for peace, but really meaning a ceasefire, should recognise that that is not a just and durable peace. And I think that was recognised in the statement that was put out. A just and durable peace is one that should be based on the UN Charter, about respect for territorial integrity, for sovereignty. Those are the values that underpin the international system. Those are the values that we will fight to champion. And no one wants peace more than President Zelensky and the people of Ukraine, but it has to be based on those principles in order to be just and lasting. Could I turn to the Daily Mail next?
Thanks, PM. You mentioned illegal immigration came up. Can I ask you about legal immigration? You said this week you're committed to reducing levels below the level that you've inherited. That's about 500,000 people. What would you say to people who voted for you at the last election on the basis that you'd keep it below half of that? Do you owe them an apology? And on a related issue, some of your colleagues think there were too many foreign students coming to Britain, staying for too long, bringing too many dependents. Even the head of the Migration Advisory Committee says there's no good reason for some of them to be staying so long. Do you agree with them, and what are you going to do about it?
On the topic of legal migration, let me be crystal clear. I think the numbers are too high, and I'm committed to bringing them down. Without getting into specific measures, to go to your second question, Jason, I'm not going to get into the specific means about that. We're obviously considering a range of options to bring the numbers down, and we'll have more to say on that shortly. But let me be unequivocal. I think the numbers of legal migration are too high, and I'm committed, and the government is committed to bringing those numbers down. As I've also said, I think the British people are very keen to see action on illegal migration. That's why one of my 5 priorities is to stop the boats. Wherever I am, that's what people talk to me about. And, we're here in Japan, and last week I was in Iceland, but I think what people at home will be able to see is we are putting this topic on the international agenda. So last week, when I was in Iceland discussing this with multiple countries, opening up negotiations with the EU for greater cooperation between Frontex, the EU's border agency, and the UK. That will be of real practical value in our ability to break the cycle of criminal gangs and to tackle illegal migration. As you've seen here, language in the G7 communique about breaking criminal gangs to tackle illegal migration. And as I said, it will be, I think, a feature of the Italian G7 presidency next year, because this is a global challenge. It's not just the UK that faces increasing illegal migration. It's many countries. The numbers were up 50, 60% on the European continent last year. So you will expect, you should expect me to keep bringing this topic up in international fora like this, and to keep making progress with our allies so that we can tackle this issue together. And that is yielding real benefit for people at home. You saw that with my engagement with Albania, where we have a new returns agreement, where we've now sent over 1,000 illegal migrants back to Albania, which is a very positive step, and the engagement that we've had with the French and President Macron in the recent summit, which again is leading to greater cooperation of British and French personnel in northern France as well. So look, these are real tangible outcomes from international engagement which will help us stop the boats, and I know that is a priority that people have. Hugo Jai from the Eye.
Thank you, Prime Minister. You've talked about the way that diplomacy can help boost Britain's economy. British car companies are warning that the industry risks collapse if new post-Brexit trading rules take effect next year. What specifically have you been asking EU partners for on this, and what will you ask them for? And will this include pushing the deadline back from next year to 2027?
I think that the issue that you've raised, Hugo, is one that has been raised not just by car manufacturers in the UK, but also car manufacturers across Europe. And as a result of that, we are having conversations with the EU about the best way to address some of those concerns. But more broadly, I would also just point everyone to the first day of this trip when I was in Tokyo and announced £18 billion of investment into the UK economy. That's a massive vote of confidence in the UK. Nissan in particular already has a £1 billion investment plan for electric vehicles with Envision in the northeast. And as you saw at the beginning of the trip, there's just enormous interest and excitement about the opportunities in the UK and a willingness to invest in it in a range of different sectors, not just in automotive, but also in clean energy, offshore wind, and other high growth sectors in the technology space. All of that is good for people at home because it's going to create jobs. Hundreds of jobs in the short term, more over the long term, and strengthening our economic security, growing our economy is very important to me, and that's where the international engagement can make a real difference. And you saw very tangibly on the first day of this trip, that engagement resulting in significant investment into the UK, big vote of confidence, and crucially, that will help us grow the economy and create and support many jobs, not just in the automotive sector, but many others too. And lastly, we've got time, I think, for one more. We're going to go to the Rio Sanada from Asahi Shimbun.
Thank you, Prime Minister. I'm Ryo Sanada from Asahi Shimbun, and I'd like to ask you a question regarding the invitation of President Zelensky. I think President Zelensky's participation was of great significance at this summit, and I believe there has been a tremendous effort in inviting him to Japan. What efforts has the UK made, and what role has the UK played in bringing him to Japan? And what are your expectations of Japan and the world in inviting President Zelensky to this summit?
Yeah. Well, Rio, I think you're right to say that President Zelensky's attendance at this summit was hugely significant. I think historic significance for the reasons that I outlined earlier. And whilst I have had conversations about this with President Zelensky in the past, it's actually Prime Minister Kishida that deserves the praise. It's Japan's presidency of the G7 and Prime Minister Kishida's leadership of it that has led to this outcome, and he deserves enormous credit for extending the invitation to President Zelensky and ensuring that the summit was successful. And I think more broadly, Japan, the Japanese people, and Prime Minister Kishida deserve enormous credit when the Ukraine conflict broke out and Russia's illegal and unprovoked war was started. Japan demonstrated that our security is indivisible regardless of where we live, whether that's in the Pacific or in Europe and the Atlantic, because the values which we all hold dear are universal. Democracy, freedom, the rule of law, those values are the same in Japan as they are in Ukraine, as they are in the United Kingdom. And the Japanese people have demonstrated their commitment to those values by supporting Ukraine in the way that they have. And Prime Minister Kishida has exemplified that by his leadership, particularly of the G7, but in particular with regard to supporting Ukraine in this conflict. And I think he should feel incredibly proud, as should the Japanese people, of how successful this summit has been in demonstrating unity of the G7 in supporting Ukraine. but also engaging those countries from the so-called global south that Prime Minister Kishida has spent an enormous amount of time with over the past several months, and I think that is something that is very welcome, because it's important for the G7 to demonstrate that it is engaging, listening with all countries from all parts of the world and responding to their concerns too. And that's what Prime Minister Kishida has done so brilliantly. And as I said, I'm very grateful to him and the Japanese people, not just for a successful summit, for their incredibly warm hospitality over the past few weeks. On a personal note, it's been a great pleasure to be back in Japan after a long time, and I particularly enjoyed my okonomiyaki making the other day, which I've had lots of people talk to me about, and Prime Minister Kishida pointed out to me that how we do that, or how you do that here in Hiroshima, is different to how they do it in Tokyo and different to Osaka. I'm sure he'd say that the Hiroshima ones are the best, and I have no reason to disagree. But it's been delicious, and the hospitality's been incredibly warm. So thank you very much to you, your country, for what you've done over the past few weeks. Thank you very much.